this panel was originally tasked with discussing basic income and work and women in the context of care and unpaid work. But in discussion with the panelists, we decided to expand our remit to include women in paid work as well, since the majority of women all over the world combine both paid work and unpaid work and care and other forms of labor. In this context, when thinking about how basic income affects women, we can't think only about gender, but also must think about different subgroups of women, because basic income can or has been thought to affect different kinds of women in different ways. So we must think about class within countries, income status of one's country, ethnicity, national origin, and native or migrant status within a particular society. To set the stage for the discussion that we're about to have, I'll just very grossly simplify the debate on women and basic income as it's developed over the past few decades. There are, generally speaking, two main views on how basic income relates to women and to women's emancipation in particular. On one view, women's emancipation comes from participation in the labor market. To the extent that basic income would enable women to stay out of the labor market, both by making it possible financially and by implicitly compensating it, it would reinforce the gender division of labor, maintaining or even increasing women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work. Therefore, on this view, basic income impedes women's emancipation. We should instead follow what's been called the Swedish model and support women's labor force participation through state provision of care services and other institutional supports. On the other hand, the other view is that women's emancipation comes from supporting women in whatever activities they choose, whether it's labor force participation, unpaid care work, or a combination of both. To the extent that basic income goes to both men and women, it could, with other institutional supports, encourage men to increase their participation in care work by reducing the financial penalty of giving up paid employment, and by giving many more women more economic voice within the family than they would have without a basic income, and that's also helped to break down the gendered division of labor. So when we have this discussion about the effect of basic income on women, we need to recognize that many women have to do both paid and unpaid labor, both work in the labor market and be primary caregivers to children and elders and others in their communities. We have to recognize that when care work is commodified, when it is paid, when it is provided as a service by the state, it is often largely done by women in any case. And that in many countries where the women who perform paid care work are migrants or ethnic minorities, in other words, those without full citizenship status or without many other labor options in that society. And paid care work, which is almost always low paid, depends on the unpaid care work of other women to care for the children or elders of the low paid workers who cannot pay for their care. So in a sense, there's a downward spiral of income from women who can earn high incomes and pay decently for care services, to those who can earn middle incomes and pay poorly for care services, to those who can earn only low incomes and require unpaid care services so that they can participate in the labor market. So instead, many argue that basic income can start an upward spiral in which everyone has the ability to either pay for decent care or forego earned income to provide unpaid care that is now recognized as something other than leisure, even if not directly compensated. What is even better is that if it is universal within a country or a region, meaning that children, the working-aged adults, and seniors get the basic income, children and those adults who are unable to care for themselves are not dependents only, but come into care relationships with their own funds to contribute to their own care. If a basic income is truly universal, in the sense that it is a global basic income, then the structural advantage that affluent women in high-income countries have over poor women is diminished, if not eliminated, but diminished. No woman would have to choose between caring for her own family or moving to another country to care for another's family and leaving her own behind. So Toru Yamamori, Annie Miller, and I together have written the gender chapter for the forthcoming Handbook on Basic Income, edited by Malcolm Torrey, that you've already heard about. In that chapter, we document that poor women's movements in the US and the UK and in other places have also called for basic income. Another movement of women, an international movement in the 1970s that began in Italy but spread to other Western countries, which was called somewhat misleadingly the Wages for Housework movement, also advocated for what we can now recognize as a basic income. They didn't really want wages for housework to pay for the hourly wage, the hourly work of doing housework. What they wanted instead was for housewives and women in general to be given the same status in society as wage laborers and working class movements, because the essential foundation for wage labor in the public sector is unwaged housework and unwaged care. And the need to truly unify the working class requires recognizing both the paid labor of primarily men and the unpaid labor of primarily women if we are to successfully struggle against domination by capital. So to address these issues, we have on this panel Annika Lillemets, former Green Party member of the Swedish Parliament, who can speak to the theory and reality of the Swedish model. Barb Jacobson, member of Bien UK and UBI Europe, and also one of the big organizers and workers behind the scenes of this conference. Thank you very much. Barb, who can speak about, yes, she deserves applause. And Barb can speak about low-income women's movements for basic income. And Renana Jabala, chair of Sewa Bharat and one of the leaders of the Madhya Pradesh Basic Income Pilot, who can speak to the empirical results in India and the situation of women in low-income countries. So let me invite first Annika Lillemets to speak, and we're each going to take about 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. And some argue, as Almas pointed out, and not least in Sweden, that the UBI would lock women in economic dependency, push us back to do care work without being paid for it, as in the bad old days before the welfare system in Sweden was established, that it would be a housewife trap. So, wouldn't women be better off on paid jobs in the public sector rather than having to care for no money? No, it's not that easy. Public sector versus UBI is a false dichotomy. I argue that a well-functioning public sector for our current and future society, as it actually is in Sweden, indeed now requires a basic income. The two complement each other and depend on each other. So let me share my reflections on this from a very Swedish perspective. And there are many aspects and little time, so I will focus narrowly on some important things regarding public sector and social security, both of which are, of course, highly relevant for women and other people. In the 60s and 70s, under social democratic rule, 44 years actually, much of the unpaid work, traditionally made by women, was converted into paid labor in Sweden and the other Nordic countries. So rather than socializing corporations, unpaid work and public services such as medical care, care for children, disabled, elderly, was actually socialized and made accessible for all. And this meant that large numbers of women got salaries and economic independence while employed in the expanding public sector. And in combination with generous social security such as parental leave, other women were liberated from unpaid responsibilities, not all but some, and were able to take jobs in any sector of the economy. And they did, our mothers did, on a massive scale. So the powerful Swedish women's movement demanded and won affordable childcare, nurseries for all, enabling mothers to enter the labor market, as well as parental leave. At first, in 1974, 6 months paid leave for mothers with the right to go back to your work, to your job. And it has since been expanded to 16 months. And in 1995, 1 month was earmarked for each parent. Now it's 3 months. The rest of it, the parents themselves decide how to share. So I give you one figure. In 2017, mothers took roughly 72% of the parental leave and fathers 28%. And I think the sharing of the most important, perhaps most important care work to be done for your children has been of tremendous importance for all involved. Not just mothers benefit, even more so fathers, I would say. Taking care of babies all day on your own is a kickstart of a deep life lifelong loving relationship that men were earlier to a large extent deprived of. And the children obviously gain maybe the most, having two equally present parents. And the effects of shared parental leave spill over to other activities in society. However, I don't have time to discuss all of that, just stating it's important for gender equality and balance of life and balance of mindset for all involved. It is profound. Another demand of the women's movement was to shorten working hours from 8 to 6 hours a day for all. This would enable women and men to equally share income, paid labor, unpaid household work, and not least free time. This fight, however, was not won, not yet. So, in the early 80s, Sweden was the most equal country in the democratic world as far as wage income concerns, not owning though. And the Swedes enjoyed excellent health care, education, etc., and good and sufficient public insurances for illness, unemployment, disabilities, and pensions. All good and becoming better. However, a neoliberal snake sneaked into our social democratic welfare paradise. And since then, things have gone worse and worse. As in many other countries, austerity policies administered by right-wing and social democratic governments alike, from the early 90s onwards, our social security system has been severely attacked and systematically eroded. The public sector has suffered in particular, and thus women, because most who work there are women. Massive layoffs have resulted in increased stress and insecurity, both among the hundreds of thousands who lost their jobs, as well as the remaining teachers and nurses and carers who have to work more efficiently, as is the Orwellian expression, in effect, fewer people doing more work. Also, the Swedish system of social security was designed for past times when people had a steady job, a full-time job, good employment. And it's, of course, now obsolete, as you know, more or less excluding the precariously employed, as in so many countries all over. Now about a third or something are really out of it, now when the need is greater than ever, just like in other countries. So, add to this that the women's movements, as I said, the women's movement's demand for 6-hour workday still remains to be implemented, with all the unpaid household work to be done, waiting for you after 8 hours of labor, very more stressful now than before, and most of the unpaid household work is still done by women, and you can imagine as things are turning bad, and combined with another vicious and surging trend that government intentionally steals from social security funds paid by citizens, by our taxes, for securing an income in case of accidents, illness, unemployment. And that is also being done by right-wing and left-wing governments alike. So actually, also the government has set a goal for reduction of the number of sick leave days per capita, resulting in a growing number of sick people who are being diagnosed by their doctors as unable to work. They don't get the insurance money they have paid for and are entitled to. And again, women are hit especially hard. As working conditions and wages have deteriorated, it's hard to make a living working as, for example, a carer for the elderly. Stress-related illness, depression, and anxiety is surging, especially among women and especially in the public sector. And needless to say, the consequences of this neoliberal slaughter of the welfare system hits hard also on the public, not just the workers. Nurses and doctors don't have time to go to the toilet during a full working day. We get these articles all the time. And they must waste ridiculous amounts of time on new public management, bureaucracy, same for teachers. So many leave their jobs to save their own health and well-being. People have already died in Sweden due to lack of nurses. And this, not the UBI, is the real trap for women. And the trap is set by government. And there is no excuse whatsoever for creating stress, anxiety, illness, and poverty in a rich society such as the Swedish. However, political decisions are not laws of nature, they are made by humans and can be changed by humans. So, a well-designed and well-funded social security and welfare system, as it used to be in Sweden, is indeed indispensable for women and for men. What we do need now is a UBI. It would mean, it would be the much needed, excuse my wording, fuck off money, empowering the exploited healthcare, care and teaching staff to demand higher wages and better conditions in the public sector that we are all dependent on sometimes during our lives. It would, of course, also liberate people from the patronizing and insecure mercy of the social security bureaucracy. Thus, UBI would, in my opinion, be the means to save and restore the public sector. Because UBI and a well-working welfare state are not interchangeable, they are complementary. I would say, where we are now, UBI would be a prerequisite for a decent public sector with a sufficient number of qualified nurses, doctors, teachers, and others. And I certainly don't believe that there are silver bullets, reforms that solve all problems just with a magic wand, cast of the whiff with a magic wand. But universal basic income is as close as it gets. And now I'm just waiting for the popular movement that people organize and find this idea, how powerful it is. Because that is what's needed. It will not come from any government. It has to come from below. There has to be a massive political pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you, Almaz. You actually covered quite a bit of what I was going to say about wages for housework. So I'll kind of change my what I'm going to say a little bit. I think really what I can most usefully say here is just to talk about some hidden aspects of feminism over the last century or so, which we don't really talk about when we talk about feminism. The first, of course, is the movement for suffrage and for the vote, which we saw in the UK and the US. One thing that is really not talked about very much with that movement is that it was a cross-class movement. Both working-class women and middle-class women got together in order to win that. Unfortunately, when the vote was won, the middle-class women kind of drifted off because the working-class women thought of the vote as a way to gain some power in order not just to gain some democratic power, but also to gain some economic power. Fortunately, in the UK, there was a woman and her group, a woman called Eleanor Rathbone. I'm sorry I don't have her actual organization to hand right now. But I recently reread her book called The Disinherited Family, which is about the women's right. She wrote it in about 1929, about the fact that mothers really need money in order to look after people properly. And of course, it was done at a time when more women were only working inside the home and not so much outside the home. She waged a 30-year battle, and something that really ought to be studied, I think, by more people, where she organized with her own group, organized with many other organizations, particularly trade unions in the North, to put pressure on the government to finally win family allowances, which was money that was paid to mothers. It was on account of the children, but she was very clear. If you read Disinherited Family, she was very clear that it was for mothers to enable the kind of care work that needed to be done. Another very interesting thing about that book is that many of the arguments that come up against basic income also come up in that book that she had to deal with in terms of winning money from others. Another aspect of this, of course, what's called, I guess, second wave feminism, I'm not sure, in the 70s, was, it seemed like, that jobs would be liberating, would be the thing that would liberate women. That's what we kind of look at now. But actually, it was a whole movement that was against all forms of work that women have to do, whether it was paid or unpaid. And there were a couple things. One was a movement of claimant union women, which Toru Yamamori has done quite a lot of work on uncovering, and they were demanding an individual payment of welfare. They were demanding that welfare not be tied to the household anymore, but that each individual be paid so that they didn't have to display their knicker drawers, as it were, to the Department of Social Security. Another movement, which is something that I was involved in kind of the end of in the 80s, was the Wages for Housework campaign. And yes, it was much more of a perspective, where the demand for wages for housework was really something that was used to uncover the unpaid work. We felt that by demanding a wage for it, that this would actually uncover this work, and that eventually, we also called all kinds of services, whether that was housing or welfare or education. We called all of that as we considered that part of the wage that we had, that women were able to get, and not just the money, although we also felt that the money was very important. I'll just kind of revert to what I was going to say. Hold on. So although 30 years ago I thought that the way to get people to recognize and value this work was to demand wages for housework, I no longer feel that a payment for the activity of looking after ourselves and others we love should be cast as a wage. I kind of agree now, now that I've raised a son and I've had some paid work myself, I kind of agree now that with pre-industrialized people who actually fought against wage work as a form of slavery, that because it was a token that the worker was tied to a set of duties or product over which he or she had limited or no control, and over a time period and conditions set by the employer. As such, I don't advocate for basic income as a payment for care, but as a recognition that we all have to do it, whatever our gender, and should have the material support we need to ensure we all can do it. One major criticism of basic income, as Almaz talked about earlier, is that it will somehow institutionalize women in the home. I have to say that in my experience, this mainly comes from academic women with jobs themselves outside their homes. The reasoning goes, as Almaz said, that because women earn less than men when they do a job outside the home, they will be more likely than men to give up their wage jobs and devote themselves to looking after children or other care work. While this sounds reasonable on the face of it, what this assumption ignores is the huge amount of work by feminist economists which shows that women are paid less outside the home because the work they do inside the home for those they love is not valued at all, either as a job and neither as an essential activity. And indeed, the lowest paid workers outside their own homes are people who are paid to do care work for others. And we also have this really obscene situation at the moment where millions of women travel over oceans and continents in order to do paid care work for other women who are paid more to do other kinds of work and having to leave their families behind. The idea that basic income would give women a choice and that there are women and men who might prefer to care for their own loved ones over doing a paid job, this does not seem to enter their head. Wages for housework faced the same criticism, largely from the same people back in the 1980s. In my experience of campaigning for wages for housework, the idea that money would institutionalize women into going back to the home was something I never heard voiced on the street. We basically had two reactions from women. One was, where do I sign up? And this was often from women who were exhausted by the double shift of both job and housework. And the other reaction we had was, how dare you put a price on my love? At the time, we felt the latter response was a bit backward, but now again, that I've raised a child myself, it seems to me that the latter response is actually the healthier position. Do we have to put a price on everything before it gets recognized as important or even essential? Whether we are looking at the ability to care for our loved ones, or whether we are looking at natural resources, the right of all to clean air, to clean water and food, to shelter, to be able to live without fear for our lives because we have the wrong skin color, follow the wrong religion, love the wrong people, or have the wrong opinion, all of which often boils down to being unlucky enough to be born in the wrong place or into the wrong family, and that's really a matter of place and class. What is the price of that? Is it an economic metric we need, or just a different set of priorities? To me, these rightly do not have a price, and they should never have a price. Our existential problems, which are, as far as I see it, are mainly war and in the environment, stem not from what should be essential rights not having a price, but from those rights not being valued in the broadest sense of the word. Some may feel that this makes my support of basic income contradictory. Doesn't basic income have to be set at some amount of money, and that amount will be the price? As we discuss what is the right level, or what is really affordable, or what is proper, depending on the place, I think we often overlook the simple symbolic value of everyone receiving the same amount of money as a foundation. Insofar as money is a symbol of worth, as well as a means to live, everyone receiving the same amount as their share, or inheritance, or dividend, or income, will have a huge impact on how people view and treat each other. It will be symbolic of the unwaged care we need to prioritize and enable that care at the same time. I'm happy to support a demand that can be fulfilled in practical programs which can be started today in a variety of places from a variety of sources. As long as we don't recognize the need to look after each other, we have no hope of looking after the beautiful earth we all need to exist. Our greatest priority right now is for both women and men to help clean up the mess we're in right now. Basic income will provide us with the time and energy to do that, and hopefully some escape from the total marketization of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to respond to something that all three speakers have said earlier, which is this criticism that universal basic income will bring women back into the home. I know you didn't support that, but that's the kind of thing that is often said. And I really want to make a plea for looking at empiricism, because you can have theoretical arguments about one way or the other, but what those theoretical arguments eventually do have to be tested empirically. And whatever empirical data I have read on the basic income does not show women going back into the home. People who do leave the work market, labor market, go either for higher studies, or in the small cases where there is a maternity, they leave the workforce. But I think this question, will a basic income withdraw women from the workforce, needs to be tested empirically and not argued theoretically. I'm going to talk today about unpaid work. And the unpaid work I would like to talk about is the one that we find mostly in countries, especially in South Asia, and I know in sub-Saharan Africa, and also I know in a lot of West Asia, but it may be in many of the other countries also. And that is unpaid work, which is really for the economy, and where somebody is getting paid somewhere, but for the woman, it is unpaid work. Let me tell you, let me give you from now the context I know best, which is the Indian context. In the rural areas, you have small farmers, and these small farmers work, the whole family works on the land. The woman does the unpaid work, and the man, he then sells the product and gets the money. But when it is actually measured by government statistics, we find that the women doing the unpaid work or the women working on the farm are not included as workers, though even according to their own definitions, they should be included as workers. We did a study in one of the states in India called Bihar, which is primarily a rural agricultural state. And we found that the government statistics said that 11% of women were working, which means 89% were doing nothing. So the 11% women working came out of the government statistics. We asked a very reputable academic institution to do an equivalent study with, of course, a smaller sample, but with the same definition. And they found that instead of 11%, it was 56%. So that kind of difference is really, that's the difference where unpaid work, almost more than 40% unpaid work, which is really for the economy. Why does that happen? Partly it happens, and it's partly all a mindset problem. So the people who go to collect the statistics don't think women are working. And so when they go to collect the statistics, they ask the man, well, what does your wife do? Oh, she does nothing, that's it. But it's also from the women themselves. I remember in this very study going to the field and talking to a woman who's working on the field weeding, and then I follow her in the evening. She goes and she milks a cow, and then she cooks for other people working on the field. And we ask her, what do you do? And she says, nothing. So the women who do unpaid work for the economy don't distinguish it from unpaid work for the family. So that continuum of unpaid work for the family and unpaid work for the economy remains the same in the women's minds as well as in the minds of society. So there is a required mindset, and it actually has a very bad effect, because in India, for example, you're seeing what we call a feminization of agriculture. More and more women are working in the fields, and more men are going away from agriculture. But there is no investment in those women. No technological investment, no research investment, no training, because they are not seen as farmers, and all their unpaid work is seen as for the family. So I want to move to the urban areas. 60% of women in the urban areas do work for the economy, but they work from their homes. So they are not only often unpaid, but also invisible. These are what we call home-based workers, and they may be women who are producing food and selling it, or their husbands are selling it in the street, or it may be women who produce down a chain of contractors for international brands. We have come across many international brands who I will not name now, but where women are doing for very, very, very low wages handwork in their homes. The money is sometimes collected by them and sometimes by the males in their family. So they see it, and again, if you ask them, what work do you do? They will say, we don't do anything. Again, when the government statistics are collected, it is that they don't do anything. So there is this huge workforce of women doing work, unpaid, invisible, where they're really contributing to the economy, but it's not recognized. How can a basic income change that? And I would like to now go to empiricism. At least I can only quote from our study right now, though there is evidence from other studies also. We had actually 3 studies in India, 1 in Delhi, and 2 in Madhya Pradesh, which you've already heard about. What did we see? We saw that when women received cash in their hands, their own mindset changed. So they no longer acquiesced to, or they no longer agreed to be an unpaid person. They were now a paid person, somebody who got cash in their hands. A lot of women in the agriculture field who were going out as laborers, decided that they would be a farmer, and they began labeling themselves as farmers, and they invested this money that they had in their farm. Some of them invested in livestock, and they became paid, or they were already doing work for the economy, but they began seeing themselves as doing work for the economy. And hopefully when the government statisticians come, or data collectors come around next, they will say that they are working. We saw a similar thing in women in Delhi in the urban areas, because when they got money in their hands, cash in their hands, they did begin to acknowledge themselves as workers. So I think the basic income is not only a social security floor addressing economic insecurity, but it is also something that gives you a different identity, where a woman did not have an identity. It gives her an identity. And I think for women, that may be, or at least for women in our part of the world, that may be a very important contribution of basic income. Thank you.
Thank you, Renana. I think that one of the things that comes out when we start having these conversations about women from different countries, different regions, different socioeconomic statuses, you actually see the connections between the experience of women, because I know that in the welfare rights movements in the United States, many of the African American welfare recipients were seeking a similar kind of status through generous welfare payments. They wanted to be recognized as mothers and that important role as mothers, just as white women had been able to do for many decades as well. So I wanted to start by asking if there were any comments from the participants on the panel on each other's presentations. Barb, would you like to start?
Just to say, I mean, one of the things that I kind of left out when I was talking about hidden parts of the women's movement is also in the late 60s and early 70s. Okay. It was African American women demanding, we hear a lot about the abortion rights movement, but the flip side of that is the right to have children. And I think that, you know, Black and particularly Native women in the US tried very, very hard to get their own struggle to have children recognized. And and so, you know, partly Wages for Housework was kind of inspired by that, but they've really been kind of left out of the conversation. And as abortion is now under attack in the US, I think it's a real problem that, again, the right to have children, and, you know, while there's a whole indigenous movement against women disappearance, and I know in Canada as well, disappearances and murder is happening. That has to be part of that. You know, our right to live has to be as important as our right to not have kids.
Thank you, Barb.
Oh, yes.
Monica.
Thank you. I think it's striking what Renana says about unpaid work and how women's work is not recognized, because my parents, they were smallholders, had a little farm, and my mum was, what she did, she worked constantly. They both worked constantly, and her work was not acknowledged in Sweden either. She didn't even get her name on like letters from authorities. This was in the 60s or 70s. They would write to Mrs. Tage Karlsson, and she was called Maria. My father was called Tage. So things have happened, and she got a job late in life near her retirement, and that changed her quite a lot. So there are similarities, although levels of poverty and so on are different. And also I would like to add and clarify, I don't really know if I did, but the power of UBI to change the public sector, obviously we need disruption when it's gone so bad, when women fare so badly, those working in hospitals and schools and so on. I think we need quite dramatic action, and UBI would perhaps be that dramatic action if people could say no, not just fall ill and then be in deep trouble and great suffering. If they could say no, I would like to work as a nurse, I really want to do that, but absolutely not for a wage that won't support me and for conditions where I can't go to the toilet all day. and where I can't do a good job, where I risk my health. And that would be very interesting, and it would be fantastic to see patients, all of us, and hospital staff joining ranks. I don't know if it will happen, but I certainly hope so.
Renana?
I wanted to actually echo something that Annika had said with the stress on care workers in the economy. And in India, we see something similar, because what has been happening is that the public sector, we are supposed to have universal health services and universal education services. They're not very good universal services, but they do exist. But what has been happening is that in earlier times, the nurses and, not the doctors, but the nurses and the attendants and so on were hired directly by the state. And so they had become government employees and had reasonable timing and reasonable wages. And what is happening in the public sector in India is that it has all become contract employing. And when you are an employee of a contractor, it means that your wages are very, very low, and also you are forced to work very long hours. And in the case of women, there is often sexual harassment. Again, if we think about the UBI, then it would give a choice to say, well, I don't take this worst work. So I just want to say that I think we are seeing it all over the world.
Once again, I recognize what you said. There's a lot of privatization and contracting too in Sweden. I mean, it's the neoliberal agenda, isn't it? So we see this as well, exactly what you say.
Yeah, it's happening in the UK as well. But also, I mean, I think what we've seen with the marketization of care work is a loss of control. And I think that's really, the key thing is that we're losing control of how we do care work, how long we do care work. We have this really horrible system in the UK now where most of the care workers are agency or contract workers, but they have 15, say if it's elder care, then they have 15 minutes with the person and they don't get paid for the time of traveling between people, all right? So then you get a lot of abuse. As a friend of mine who's also a UBI supporter says, and she has a sister who's in the care system, says, she really wants the care worker to want to do that work and to have some control over it, and I think that's a really important priority. So, yeah.
Annika, one more comment?
Once again, very similar to Sweden, and I think since big money can be made out of contracted or privatized care, hence the resistance against it, and so much shame on our governments who serve big corporations and profiteers rather than the people.
So I'd like to take, say, 3 questions at a time. And again, for the first round, if we can prioritize people who haven't spoken at the Congress and who haven't asked questions. Okay, I see 2 very strongly waving hands. Let's start with the young lady in the front row.
My answer is to Renana. My question. With the benefit, what were the relationship between the couples? Did the husbands accept this female empowerment? Has there been a reduction in domestic violence?
Okay, thank you. And then next question in the middle, in the center, the gentleman raising his hand.
My name is Clemens Witte, Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute from Berlin. And I have a question to Renana and also to the others on the panel. Like that, I understood you like that female workers got more access to their self-worth due to the cash they received. And I just wanted to ask if this is some kind of kickstart that goes on and is a first initial step, or that there's also the danger that if this cash then is disappearing, they go back to this early stage. And the second question is on the rollout of UBI in Sweden, because Sweden is in international comparison a relatively well-functioning welfare state. How would you roll out an UBI there? Thank you.
Okay, do we have one more question from somebody who hasn't really spoken much before in the Congress? I think the woman in the back, is that Diana?
Thank you. I just had a question to Renana also. Has there been any negative impact from the increase of emancipation of women when it is perceived by the men, so a negative reaction by the men, given the emancipation after the caste transfer? Thank you.
All right, so let's start with Renana, and then also give an opportunity to Barb and Annika to join in after Renana has spoken.
Let me take the three issues. One is the acceptance of empowerment by the men. Surprisingly, it was actually quite positive, the acceptance. And of course, it didn't happen overnight, and the experiment went on for 18 months. And it happened gradually. We didn't even realize that it's happening. And then over time, we are seeing more and more women being more vocal, coming out more, and so on. And I want to tell a little story which we haven't talked about earlier, which is in one of the villages, there were some very rich farmers, very rich farmers. And they had other businesses also. And they said, you know, you may be universal, but we don't need your money. It's so little, it doesn't matter to us. And we don't want to give you access to our bank accounts. So we said, okay, so those people were excluded. And then after 3 months, the women from those communities came to us and said that we would like to have a basic income because we have everything. We have food, we have jewelry, we have clothes, we have everything, but we don't have cash. So they did join the basic income. But we don't really know what it did to domestic violence because we were not able to measure it. We see that sometimes it does increase domestic violence. And some women do drop out of a movement because of this. But here I think because it was cash, direct giving of cash, we didn't see any very negative consequences, except somebody asked about the negative reaction. It wasn't for women. We saw a negative caste reaction. In fact, I should give one thing. When Shikha and Guy and I had gone to one village, and we had gone to the lowest caste community, which was still very, very dirty area. They didn't have any facilities and so on. And then when we came back and came to the main area of the village, then we got some very negative reactions. And after we left, the whole program got some very negative reactions not because they felt we were empowering the women, but because we were empowering certain castes. And finally, the question about self-worth disappearing, I have a very nice empirical answer to that, which is that we did the study 5 years later. 2012, our experiment ended. 2017, we did something we called a legacy study, and we found that the empowerment, especially the empowerment aspect, had not gone, and that women were as outspoken, and maybe a little bit more, because they had more time to empower themselves than previously.
Annika.
Yeah, I might say something about how to roll out a UBI in Sweden. That would be a tall order, I would say, because there's a strong fixation with this idea that labor, regardless of whether it's useful or good or whatever, is the meaning of life and the source of all good. It's like fetishism of labor in Sweden, which I think is stronger than in many other countries, actually. So that makes it difficult. I would guess that maybe the best thing to do would be to have some kind of natural resources taxation, like we have a CO2 tax already, and maybe to pay dividends and give it back to people, as in something like Canada. Maybe that would be acceptable for people and kind of lower the threshold for even for more of a UBI that you could actually live off. And there is actually a discussion on that now, and some green ministers, the green spokespersons have endorsed the idea of CO2 tax and dividends back. But the other, that people are deprived of their rights when they fall ill or unemployed, well, that's a diabolic mechanism. I mean, you're fine, and you probably people do tend to still believe that we have a safety net that's covering, that will catch us when we fall, which we don't any longer, really. We cannot at least be sure of it. But then when you fall, you're not in the position to fight for your rights if you're, for instance, stressed out and depressed. But maybe it has to be worse before it gets better, and when many people have fallen out of the security systems, and when the situation in the public sector, for instance, and the labor market becomes so blatantly bad for so many people, maybe things will change. Young people tend to think differently than older generations, and I have a hope in them that they will step up and think differently and require their rights, actually demand their rights.
Okay, just a couple of points to make. In terms of the relationship between couples, one thing that, because family allowance, which then turned into child benefit, is probably the closest the UK has ever been to a basic income. It has to be acknowledged as well that not so much now because child benefit has been eroded so much over the last 30 years. It should be about £50 per child if it had kept up with inflation, but it's in fact about £20
per month?
Per week.
Per week.
Yeah. But, one thing that we also heard a lot in the 80s, and also earlier than that in the 70s, were stories of women who used child benefit in order to leave bad relationships. Sometimes it was the only money that they could rely on. But also, I think we also have to acknowledge that going into paid work also did, although it's not, I wouldn't say that it's ultimate liberation, it does give women some independent money. And that's certainly, in the Wages for Housework campaign, that's what we were always arguing for, is that women need independent money. Okay. And then one more thing. No, that's it, actually.
Okay. And just to add to that, in the African American Women's Welfare Campaign, one of the leaders of that campaign compared the existing welfare system, conditional, means-tested, intrusively monitoring of their behavior, particularly whether they had a so-called breadwinner in the house. They characterized it as a super sexist marriage, right? Or the relationship with the state was like a super sexist marriage. You exchange control by your husband for control by a man, for control by the man, the state, over your sexuality, your life, your money, etc. Okay, let's take another round of questions for our panelists. Questions, comments, and let's keep them brief so that we have time for the responses. Okay, Peter, let's start with Peter in the center here, in the front.
Yes, this is for all of you. There's a new kind of labor that hasn't even been mentioned here, and that's called in a recent book by an Indian and an American, ghost work. It's done on computers and it's piecework for the most part. And there's positive and negative critiques of this, and including that it allows people to choose to use their time in the home if they have access to a computer or even a cell phone, and sometimes they even share bandwidth. So I was wondering if in that modern form of labor, either of you are familiar with it, would care to comment.
Okay, let's take a few more questions. Liz, up here in the upper right.
This is a history question about Sweden in particular, but maybe more broadly as well. And I'm curious as to why in this 1970s moment when women were able to win a lot of gains, I'm curious about this 1970s moment in Sweden when women were able to make so many gains, why they were able to gain certain things like parental rights and not others like shorter working hours. And if you think there's any kind of logic behind what was won and what wasn't won.
Okay, let's take two more questions. Yes, gentlemen.
Question about children and about women. We've seen in pilots that the UBI for children has been 0 and sometimes half of what an adult would get. In my organisation, we think that children should get the full basic income because they are a citizen of the world. Does the panel have any view on how much children should get?
Okay, let's take two more questions. There's a woman in the back.
Just a quick clarification question for Renana. Why weren't you able to measure domestic violence in the pilot?
Okay, and then last question, how about Philippe? And then we'll go to the panel for responses, and then we can continue the conversation over lunch.
Thank you. One objection that's sometimes made to basic income in Europe is that it will increase even more the scarcity of people willing to do certain jobs that are particularly important and that are more than proportionally filled by women, in particular nurses and school teachers. And so you give people the opportunity to reduce their working time, to have a career break, and as a result of that, you have an even greater shortage than you have now in these particularly important public sector jobs. So what's your response to that?
All right, panelists, you have a number of questions to answer, and you can add in any final reflections. Who would like to begin? Annika?
It's a very good question. I was 8 years old, 1970. That you put. Why did the women's movement win some battles and others not? Well, I'm not an expert in replying to that. I guess maybe Guy could say something. There would be economic interests, of course, against shortening working hours, because there was a great need in the industry at the time, and also in the public sector for workers. So maybe that's it. I mean, there were also abortion rights and other types of rights that were won. So that's my guess and speculation. I'm sure there's some people in the audience who knows more than I do. And then, Philippe, what you said about the shortage of nurses and teachers. Well, in Sweden, we have it already. There are constantly articles now in the newspapers, tens and thousands, and that's many in Sweden, have left their professions because the conditions are intolerable. And normally people say the conditions, the wages are also bad, but it's the working conditions. The professionals want to do their job. And I think this is already happening. So it would be much, much better to have a UBI that they could say no. They could say, we love our professions. We want to do our jobs. We don't want to fill in idiotic, bureaucratic statistics, formulas of new public management. And we want to be able to go to the toilet. And we want to be so many so we can guarantee that patients don't die because we are so overworked. Give us those conditions and we will work. And if not, we will live off our basic income. That would kind of put it, it would make it very, very visible. And then it would be a pressure upwards. And many other jobs would disappear and that no one would miss them. So I don't know if it's possible. Maybe it's utopic to think that this would happen. But the alternative is scary.
Paul, you asked a question about children. I certainly would definitely support having, including children in a basic income. Again, we sort of, as I was trying to say in my speech, we kind of focus in on the figures and how much stuff, things are going to cost, and not really what our priorities are. And our priorities really have to be about, they really have to be about raising the next generation. And providing the means to actually do that. So I would certainly always support a basic income that includes children. One thing I didn't quite say on the domestic violence issue, and it doesn't quite answer this question, but one thing we have certainly seen with the erosion of benefits in the UK, the erosion of child benefit, the lack of housing, et cetera, is a huge increase in violence against women, both in the home and outside of the home. It's something, while the demand at the moment, unfortunately, is just for, better shelters and, better places where women can escape, the actual fundamental issue of the fact that people, not just women, but also men, really don't have enough money and have to exist and have too much stress in order to get that money, I think is actually the fundamental issue that really needs to be addressed. And I agree totally with what Annika said in terms of the question of shortages of nurses and teachers. What we're also seeing in the UK is a kind of siphoning off of healthcare staff in order to do these insane disability assessments, which are separate from people's application for disability. And it means that the welfare office can then ignore what doctors and specialists who've worked with people for many years have said about how their disability affects them. And I think that's really something that needs to be addressed very urgently. It's never the cost to the NHS or to the National Health Service of not only siphoning off staff, but also the great increase in ill health and disability, and also the huge increase in workload on GPs and other doctors working in the system in order to defend their patients' money, which they are finally realizing is something that they actually need as much as they need medicine, I think really has to be addressed. And we can't kind of look at these issues as separate little pockets.
Thank you. Renana, the final word.
Just a quick response, because I don't have that much to say. The new kind of labor, at least in India, we haven't seen it so much on computers at home. But what we do see a lot is things that are done on the telephone, and especially sales jobs. And those are very difficult jobs, actually, because you face a lot of abuse on the phone it's insurance companies and so on. So you can imagine when a woman phones, or even men, and ask people about insurance and what the kind of thing that they have to hear. These jobs are really increasing because the phone has just become so widespread. So, but we haven't really studied that in any way. About the children one, I think, thank you for raising that. When we calculated how much should go to the, as the UBI, we actually did it fairly scientifically. We just did we said it shouldn't be an employment wage. So we took the poverty line figure and halved it and said this would be a sort of security. But then we just didn't think about it and said half for the children. Or maybe we did, and maybe our researchers have a response, but I'm not sure. But anyway, thanks for raising it, because next time we should be thinking about what about the children? Should it be half, or should it be zero, or should it be equal or more? And finally, the issue on domestic violence. It's not that we couldn't measure it, it's just that we didn't measure it. And in fact, we hardly measured anything on inter-family relationships. We just had a few subjective questions on inter-family relationships, and that also more material type of questions. But we did have, and partly that was because partly it was because we were focusing so much on the welfare effects and the economic effects that we didn't have time. We didn't actually bring this in because the questionnaire became 40 pages and took about an hour and a half to answer. But maybe it's something that should be done separately. The empowerment effects that we saw later were actually not part of the questionnaire, like the veil lifting and all that. And perhaps next time we do it, we'll actually bring in empowerment effects much more clearly. So thank you.
Thank you, Renana. So just as a final note, I will add that I also, like Barb, I do believe that the basic income should go to children, and I think there are good reasons for it to be the full amount that should go to children as well as adults. And I'll just close by recalling a video message that Democratic presidential candidate in the U.S., Andrew Yang, sent to the last North American Basic Income Conference in June. And in the video, he said something I thought was very powerful, very moving. He said, imagine the conversation between parents and their children saying that when you turn 18, you will get $1,000 a month from your government because your country loves you, your country supports you, your country believes in you. And I remember when I first saw that thinking, yes, but imagine how much more powerful it is to say, for a parent to be able to say to a child, you've been getting, or we've been getting on your behalf, $1,000 a month since the day you were born because your country loves you, your country supports you, and your country wants to allow you to reach your fullest potential. So I think that that's a very strong reason for a basic income for children. All right, before I let you go to lunch, we have two tasks. One task is to thank our wonderful, very distinguished panel and majority women panel, the first one in this conference, for their comments. And the second one is, actually we have two more. We have three tasks. The second one, I think, is that we're going to thank our panelists with a gift. So Sarath, I will let you conduct that while we do our third task, which is that we have two announcements before we break for lunch. The first one from Jenna and the second one from Carl. Where's Jenna going? Okay. Oh, Jenna's putting up some wallpaper. Should we bring Carl up while you're bringing that up? Carl.
Thanks. Perfect. Okay. Hi. I am the editor of Palgrave Macmillan's book series called Exploring the Basic Income Guarantee. And this series has been going for 10 years. We've been publishing 2-3 books a year. The latest one just came out, edited by Elise Klein and several others on basic income in Australia. And I want to alert everybody to it that this is for some books, this is a very good publishing opportunity. It is an academic press. It has a for-profit academic press, and I'm not getting into the profits. I get paid by Georgetown to do this as service, and I'm giving service to I'm not getting paid for this, so I have no interest in just getting people signed up if they aren't good. But it has to be academic books for an academic audience, and you have to be satisfied that they're going to price it really high and make it available to university libraries at a price only they can afford, which to academics is valuable because then it will be in thousands of libraries, university libraries where other researchers can find it. If you do that kind of publishing, this could be an opportunity to you, and I have a very good record of getting people contracts when they come to me. So if you have ideas for an academic book on basic income, if you can spell my name, you know my email. It's carl@whiterquist.com. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, and now just a very quick announcement that the most sacred occasion of the 12th International Basic Income Week is almost upon us. It's September 16th to 22nd. There's the logo and poster on the screen. So just a reminder to participate by doing whatever you're already doing, the awesome organizing or research or meetings or whatever you're already doing, to continue to do it and to record whatever you're doing during that week on the website. So you can log your events. And it really helps to boost the international profile of our network because people in Singapore can reference events that are happening in Scotland. And in fact, we can do global coordinated activities as well, which there are 2 of this year. One is on Friday. It's like a basic income beer event, Stämmisch, I think, and somebody who's German can tell you more about it, but it's a really cool idea. Friday, September 20th, everybody's going to gather and have a basic income beer wherever they are in the world, so join. Saturday, the 21st, there's a basic income march. You can find details about all of those things and how you can recreate them in your own area on the website, basicincomeweek.org. And the theme for this year is money. Let's make this invention work for everyone. Thanks.
Okay, I still can't believe that I'm standing at this moment and after completing the 4 days. So I'm a little breathless. First is that it's very difficult to thank because I am just the face of this organizing, but there is an army behind me, and I'm anxious that if I start listing the names, your lunch will be further delayed. So I'm not going to do that. But I would like to thank NALSA. They have been extremely helpful. They have given us everything free, and they have been very kind and also very liberal with rules and regulations. They have made exceptions to really make this Congress a big success. So I would like all of you to give an applause to NALSA University campus and particularly Professor Amita Danda and Professor Mustafa.